See, does the stream work? This is a test for the beginning of the stream to see if the stream is working properly. This is a test. Okay, yes, it's working properly. This stream is going to be called Education, the Battleground of the Mind. Now, something that I wanted to talk about with public education, and to start it off with a very quick story, we have somebody named Jose Vasconcelos. Let's see what they say in the About section. Jose Vasconcelos Calderón, called the cultural caudillo of the Mexican Revolution, was an important Mexican writer, philosopher, and politician. He is one of the most influential and controversial personalities in the development of modern Mexico. Now, very interesting story about this guy. If you've ever seen murals, you know how they'll paint a mural of some influential figure, and it's kind of like not a memorandum, but like, it's just a mural and they're trying to like honor this person. Sometimes you'll see it of Cesar Chavez. In Mexico, you'll probably see Benito. I wanted to say Benito Mussolini, but he was the dictator. But beyond that, essentially, he was somebody who popularized and used murals back in the day to popularize certain movements. Some of his more controversial things that he's ever written were La Raza Cósmica, the cosmic race. But his theory on that is kind of flawed. On a quick story, he's basically somebody who saw the modern theory of how humanity, or how humans, got to Mexico. And what he kind of theorized, to bring up a map, let's see, Google Maps. Let's go to Google Maps real quick. He essentially theorized that if the ice bridge theory was real, and the ice theory being essentially that if humanity started in Africa, made their way up north towards Russia, and then crossed over to Alaska, and then further down into Mexico, he essentially theorized that if that group of humans kept moving and eventually settled down into Mexico, he theorized, well, if we are some of the oldest people that took the longest trip to get to these certain areas, he essentially theorized that Latinos themselves were what you would want to call the purest race. And by that, he essentially meant that they were just nomads, right? They just kept walking. But eventually them settling down here, by the purest race, he essentially said that that was the purest form of the human genome that existed, considering how long it would have taken them to get to these areas in Latin America. And he kind of theorized that if other races were to mingle or marry into the Latin race, they were essentially somewhat, this is where you get controversial, superior, and then, it develops into a really weird thing. But if you look into the history of all that, and if you look into the theory of how humanity got to Latin America, the more modern theories, it doesn't really hold any validation. It was just a very popular theory that he theorized back in, I want to say the 1940s, 1930s. Not the point that I'm getting to. He's also accredited to being, former Secretary of Public Education of Mexico. Well, that was very short-lived. He only really got to be the Secretary of Education for, I want to say, 2 years, because he ran into a wall that even he couldn't. I just realized the joke that I made there, but it's not a very nice joke. But essentially, he ran into a problem. He essentially created a very good lesson plan. He developed what we would call, primary school, secondary school, and high school. But when he submitted his proposal to the president that he was serving under, which was Alvaro Obregón, he was denied. And a lot of that came with backlash, not from anyone in Mexico, but from the United States. essentially Washington, D.C. kind of intervened and forced him to change his plan, which is why he eventually stepped down from his Secretary of Public Education role in Mexico. Now, this was at a time where it was like the 1940s. So why would Washington, D.C. have any say in what another country does with their public education sector? Well, this is where we get to the problem of public education. Because public education, if you look into the history of this, at least, let's say for the United States, the US, you have people like John Dewey, who were a very integral role he played a very integral role in developing our modern education system. And a lot of that was thanks to the development of, this is where you get all conspiracy theory, the Rockefeller Institute, the Carnegies, which can't even spell, so I'm just going to leave dots. But you had basically a board of trustees that largely got to dictate what was the central role of public education. These figures themselves, to this day, oh yeah, we could also add Ford in here, the Ford Institute, since they still sponsor some of the largest schools that exist in America. But it doesn't really fully emphasize what I'm trying to say here, because even public education, before public education became what it is now, there was only very few institutes that offered education, period. And that's where you get into what we call seminary schools. And seminary schools were primarily dictated by, this is where nobody knows this, the Catholic Church. Now, not to say that the Catholic Church has always had an iron fist in what was taught, because even during this time, during early, like, I want to say year 1200, year 1400, seminary schools were only fairly popular because there needed to be a way to teach the populace. And even then, some of the more larger schools were, I don't want to say entirely Catholic based, they were just entirely funded by the Catholics. And if you look into some of the oldest universities, a lot of them were Catholic. Not going into that rabbit hole of like, oh yes, it was the Catholic Church that did all this. It's like, no. Eventually, this led to seminary schools, and seminary schools gave way to at least having a backbone for these, what we call influential figures, for them to notice, or at least have a background, or what do you want to call it, a foundation to build off of. But either way, back to public education. John Dewey essentially based a lot of modern United States education off of the USSR. You look into the history of John Dewey, if you look into a lot of his actual personal writings, this isn't, when I say personal writings, like he had his own journals, he had his own diaries that are still submitted to the Library of Congress. You could actually see what his philosophy was. And, if you read material that is written about John Dewey, a lot of it's fluffed up material. They don't really want to get into the backbone of where his methodology came from, which was, I don't even know if I want to mention these names, but we'll go that into a different video because I did not bring that up right now. But John Dewey visited the USSR and did basically a case study on what was the role of public education in the development of the USSR. Afterwards, he brought his research material, and essentially his research material was funded by the Rockefellers, the Ford Institute, etc., etc. Not the point. None of that is the point. We can get lost in the weeds of what he thought and how he wanted to control the American populace with how they were largely taught, but that's not where we're going with this. Where we're going with this is looking at where the money came from. Understanding that public education has one flaw, And it's not even that it's a, I don't want to say specialized. I don't want to say secular. I want to say a proprietary system. I want to say it's essentially a closed system. And the reason why I want to say it's a closed system is because usually with closed systems, they're guided by their funding. And their funding largely comes from where? You want to say taxes, but in reality, it comes from lawmakers. Yeah, why was I going to put a W? Lawmakers. Now, I want to say lawmakers because when you think about it, lawmakers are essentially people that pass bills. They're the people that lobby. They're the people that have an essential role in Congress. And when you look at lawyers and when you look at the University of Lawyers, a lot of top lawyer schools are funded by the Rockefellers, the Fords, and the Carnegies. And this goes into even bigger weeds and like woo-woo of what they're doing there, but that's not the point because, you would have to look at the fact that a lot of lawyers and lawmakers, or at least the most influential ones, come from Yale. And they come from, we could say Stanford. We can say a variety of different universities, but I'm just going to type out the biggest ones, which are the Ivy League schools. And if you look at who primarily funds, right, this goes back into funding. You look into who funds a lot of these universities, a lot of it's private. Now that matters for different reasons because there is a big difference when you get into the role of education when it comes down to private funding. Well, I have to cross out public because in private funding, the schools themselves get to dictate what goes on in these. If it's a private funded school, they are essentially allowed freedom of who they hire, who they allow to teach, what kind of classes they're allowed to teach, etc., etc. Because if you get into the public education stuff, you are forced into the A through G class structure. Now, A through Gs are essentially, it's kind of why a lot of the advice that you get if you go into universities, they always tell you the first 2 years that you spend there, it's kind of a waste of money because you're forced into this A through G structure, which is being forced to get taught biology, English, math. Even if you're not any of these majors, you're still kind of forced to take these classes only because it's a part of the system. It's a part of the curriculum, we'll call it that. But back to private funding and private funding and public funding. Now, when you're in public funding, you're forced into this A through G class. You're forced into following what we call standardization. And by standardization, this essentially falls into back here to what bills, what lobby groups, and Congress themselves. Through standardization, you're forced into a very particular category. You're forced into a very particular way of teaching your classes. Now, with standardization, one of the biggest things that came from standardization was no child left behind. Now, this is something very modern. This happened around, I want to say 2001 to 2007. That was essentially around the time that I was in school in Texas. Now, I always heard very interesting things living my life. But when I was in high school in 2007, I heard something very interesting from teachers. And that was the complaint of multiple choice testing. And one of the things that I overheard, I can't remember why I was in the office at the time. Really can't remember why I was in the office at the time. It wasn't when my friend set his pants on fire for sure, but that's besides the point. And something that they said about multiple choice testing was it lacked, what do you want to call it? We'll say lacked imagination. And by imagination, what I'm trying to say is it lacked the ability to test for, right? Because you were forced into a category. You were forced into picking A, B, C, or D. Instead of what testing used to be, which was a free format test, which allowed you to write in your answer. So it gave the teacher the ability to discern if you were able to know what the material was or was not. So by being forced into categories, A, B, C, or D, it essentially took away the cognitive ability to tell if the student knew the material. It's kind of why if you get tested for that, it's basically math. Math is the only one that you'll kind of get like an extra sheet of paper and it says, show your work. Beyond that, you don't really get much out of that. But that's when you're forced into standardization. You're forced into the stringent thought process of, when you're just forced into following what people at the top are essentially telling you to do. And either way, back to private schooling though. In private schooling and in Ivy Leagues, and Johns Hopkins is a great example of this. Johns Hopkins, where would that fit in? Either way, lawmakers, Yale, private, whatever. So back to private schooling. And in private schooling, I'm going to use Johns Hopkins as an example. Only because this school essentially largely was dictated for a lot of what happened with this organization. This organization used this university's research material in getting to decide what the rules were for a lot of what happened during these last 4 years. More on that later, but not in this video. So with Johns Hopkins, we essentially got, the reason why I'm bringing up Johns Hopkins in terms of private schooling is because Johns Hopkins gets to hire a lot of the top teachers. Well, I don't even want to call them teachers. They just have the pick of the crop. And that also fits in with Ivy League schools like MIT. MIT is a perfect example of this, because what these private universities will do is hire a lot of not top teachers, but they'll hire the top echelons of people of their field. And so saying top teachers isn't a great example of this. What I should say is, what is a word that I could use for this situation? We'll say top employees. So with Johns Hopkins, there's an individual who used to work for the NSA. There's a great interview that I think I've talked about in this channel, but he was an NSA analyst at the time. And he was the person that got to develop, what was the name of the device? The Vinson. Should probably write this better. The Vinson. The Vinson is a very interesting device that is cryptologically closed. It's basically a device that uses cryptography. Cryptography being a randomized set of numbers, algorithms that essentially allow it to be unhackable. But the Vinson itself is just a communication device. But it used cryptography as a means of closing the message. So essentially, it wouldn't allow for interception. It wouldn't allow for the enemy of war to be allowed to see what American soldiers were passing to one another. But the Vinson was largely used by spies. That's a very different topic. But Johns Hopkins was the first person to ever reach this NSA analyst. And he was like, hey, We know what you're doing. You're the top of your field. Let's hire you. So private schooling, Ivy Leagues, and a lot of these top universities get to pick the top employees of a variety of different sectors. Top employees of their respected sectors. Meanwhile, when you look at public education, when you look at the public side of things with their teachers, now with public schooling, the teachers that they get are the teachers that apply. There's a big difference in this because you have one set of universities that essentially get to pick the best employees, the best people of their respective fields. Meanwhile, teachers in the public education sector are just people that apply. And more often than not, the teachers, not to belittle any of these teachers, but a lot of times the teachers that are applying to these positions aren't necessarily the top of their field. They're not people who are essentially putting their craft that they put on the field, put at the front, like the forefront. Everything they've learned is by working in the field. It's essentially people who went to classes, people who learned from the standardization side of testing. This is where it gets really bad because, right, it's essentially me saying that if you go to a public university, you will not, by no means, get the same level of education. And this gets into an even bigger problem because when you look at public education themselves, you get into the biggest, most jaw-dropping problem from public education, which is, where can I write this? Oh, let's put that right here. We get the book industry. The book industry. Now, the reason why the book industry is a huge problem, because they have only one thing in mind, which is selling you a book every year. And that's their biggest thing, selling another book every year. So that means, and this is only for, at least in university, it becomes a very noticeable problem because you'll go to a class and the teacher will ask you, have you bought the new latest edition? Because if you have the old book and the old edition, we can't teach you. And a lot of times it's because in selling a book every year, they reorganize the chapters. There's no new material. Rarely is there ever new material. In reality, what they do is they just reorganize the chapters, reword a few things, probably change the pictures that are in the book, and that's it. This goes into an even bigger problem because how does the book industry get away with this? Well, we got to look at the bills, the lobbyist groups, and Congress, because they're essentially the ones that are governing over this particular side of the industry, the book industry. This is a problem that just kind of feeds into itself. Now, where else could I go with this? Not where else I could go with this, but so you get into this very unilateral problem where a lot of where the problem stems from is Congress. It comes from the fact that there is an industry. Did I just make a new web? I could just make a new web. So, public education, or actually, I'm just not going to put public. Education itself stops being about educating people, and it starts being an industry. It starts being about profit-making capabilities. Now, the education industry has a variety of different problems. The workers, right? Talking about how there is a private firm, as in Ivy League schools, who get to pick the best teachers, and the public verse of things. Not to say that there aren't good public teachers. I should really stress this. I'm not trying to belittle public education or public education teachers. It's just that Not everyone's the same. Not everyone has the same background. Not everybody has the same level of education. And that's a problem that stems from the fact that this is an industry and not everybody's in it for themselves is what I'm trying to say. Now, with public industry, we have the problem with the worker force. We have a problem with Congress, or at least government as a whole, because they're the ones that are essentially being lobbied. They're the ones that have, we'll call them, variety of different industry sectors. Because essentially what usually happens with Congress and government is that the industry sector themselves has lobbyist groups that will then go into Congress and tell them, hey, make it easier for us to sell these books. Hey, make it easier for us to do X, Y, or Z. And when you have the industry themselves kind of lobbying for Congress to do something about it, what usually happens is Congress will then take private, what do you want to call them? Private contracts. Private contracts for selling a certain amount of books, selling a certain amount of reprints, or like, hey, that one book that we sold 1 million copies to you for X, Y, or Z. Let's say integrated science. What will usually happen is the private industry will have a lobby group that'll go to Congress and tell them, hey, we noticed that you need to be updated on biology. So let's make a private contract for us to sell you another biology book that really has no new information, no new modern science. We're just going to reorganize the chapters. Right? It's a self-feeding mechanism of money laundering. That's what I call it. Now, with the workers, government and Congress, and the education industry, I want to get to one of my favorite songs, which is weird because why am I going to play a song right now? But let's see what it's.
All in all, you're just another brick in the wall.
Very scary for me to bring that up. But the education industry understands, right? Because you have to look at this from a nation building point of view. And when you're looking at this from a nation building point of view, you understand that the education sector is reality just a pump out of workers. Or some people like calling them drones. Some people like calling them NPCs. Very, very degrading for me to put this way, but it's just what it is. Because the nation itself, right? Congress understands that there needs to be a new pump out of workers every so often. Now, kind of a little side note that we can make is from the marketing industry. The marketing industry, let's put that right there. The marketing industry knows that there are new 18-year-olds every year. And it creates a demographic of youth, that's what they call them, from 18-year-olds to, what is the age? I think it's 27, right? So from 18 to 27, that's considered the target demographic. Kind of retarded right now. I don't know. Demographic. Either way. The target demographic. Essentially, they understand that, and this goes now, this isn't 18 anymore. Now, this is anywhere between the ages of 13 to 27. The reason for this number is because of the video game industry. A great example of this is the Fortnite pass, if you know what I mean. Those V-Bucks, right? We got into the digitalization of, what do we want to call them? I want to call them digital currencies, but in reality, they're not digital currencies in the sense of like Bitcoin or Ethereum. It's more a digital currency that you can only really use inside of certain games, right? That's where you get into whatever Call of Duty calls theirs. Um, what's the basketball game called? 2K. Then you also have FIFA with their sports packs. You also have the NFL with theirs, etc., etc. The problem keeps exasperating here. But fully knowing that there are new 13-year-olds every year, fully knowing that this group of 13-year-olds will eventually turn to 27, the industry itself knows that as long as they keep in track and as long as they follow this demographic of people, they can follow the trends. And in following the trends, you can always sell items. So, back to nation building. Right? This is kind of a long, convoluted thing of explaining the fact that this is a science that's been largely explored because there are industries that kind of depend on knowing that there are new groups of people coming out every year. And fully knowing this, the public education industry knows that this new group of people from the ages of, what the fuck is pre-K, right? Right? Essentially knowing that they need workers, drones, NPCs, to put them into the cycle of what I call from PK all the way to high school. Because not everybody makes it to university. Let's just be honest with that. And then if you make it to university, that's a whole other wave of people that get put into other situations. That goes back into the problem of government, right? Because if you're in university here in the United States, you know what is FAFSA. And if you know what FAFSA is, it's essentially the financial aid that you get from the government itself. And if you're a minority like me, or if you're a minority at all in the United States, you just get a bunch of free money for fucking no reason. And they kind of, in the way that they put it to you, in the way that it's introduced to you, is just so, I want to say evasive, because everybody tells you to go to university. Everybody tells you, apply here, do this, do that. And if you live in California, you get oodles more money because California itself just offers more money. And I think it's called the Bell Grant, but that's besides the point. Either way, right? Fully knowing in this nation building scheme, the public education industry knows that you're going to go to pre-K. They know you're going to elementary school. They know you're going to go to middle school. They know you're going to high school. And then eventually, if they sucker you into it, you're going to go to university. And if you go to university, don't forget, there are loans attached to this. And loans, at least I have 4 older sisters. Loans used to be pretty risky. From, I want to say, from the 70s, from the 70s to the 90s, getting a loan to go to university was pretty risky. That a lot of the times, banks, they used to be really hardcore with looking at your grades. They used to actually go through everything you've ever done in school to see if you were worth the risk. Keep that in mind, if you were worth the risk. So, either way, there used to be a risk attached to this. But now, the banks don't exist in this equation. Because now, a lot of this is government. Thanks to FAFSA. Either way, it's a whole other bag of worms that you can open up in this situation. But I'm just talking about the education industry and the problems and the pitfalls of the public education industry. So, back to nation building and needing workers. Now, if you have workers, you need to know that there is a bare minimum of what they need to know. Actually, I don't even know if I want to go with that angle. That just sounds pretty terrible. Either way, the education industry, workers, And then we get into the book industry. But I think the problem that I'm trying to really exasperate here is the industry knows that it needs to have a bare minimum. That's actually where I want to go with this. They're doing the bare minimum. They don't want you to be too smart, that you run off, start your own business, create your own empire. They don't want that. What they essentially want, and it's kind of a weird way to say this, is because they give you the bare minimum, teach you the bare minimum, because there are industries that need you. And that's where we get into blue collar workers, white collar workers. And both of these only fit into one thing: pre-existing industries. Because usually what happens in this situation, where you have Congress working with the industry sector hiring lobbying groups, and then when they hire these lobbying groups, they go to Congress, and then most times they give these congressmen, these politicians, these representatives, they hand them money in order for them to get private contracts. The pre-existing industry, there is something that they want. You want to know what they want? They don't want competition. They don't want competitors. They do not want people messing with their structures. A great example of this, at least for people like me who live in the hood, is what happens when a new kid comes around the block trying to sell his product. What do you think the pre-existing gang member or related person who is selling his product, what do you think that pre-existing product seller is going to do to the new kid in the block who's trying to sell his product? Any answers? Well, that's usually what you get a lot of in today's industry. A great example of this is Instagram. Instagram used to be its own private firm. What happened? They were bought out by Facebook. Oops. They were bought out by Facebook. Another example of this is WhatsApp. Usually what you have in the technology sector is the technology, like if you want to survive in the technology sector, you need to buy out your competition. Or at least that is what's occurred in the last 10 years. Anytime Facebook saw an emerging tech firm or an emerging thing that was going to interrupt their business model, what did they do? They just bought them out in reality. And nowadays, it's kind of rare for you to see an application that exists within its own ecosystem. That's kind of why TikTok is a very interesting thing, but it gets into a whole other bag of worms. And a lot of that kind of involves Congress. But that's not what we're going with today. So the pre-existing industries wants to make sure that there is no more competition at all. They completely kill out any competition that they don't want. And in doing so, it requires something from the very beginning. It requires a poison to be administered into the workforce from the very beginning, which goes into the education industry. This gets very into the woo-woo because it's a very depressing idea to think that from the very beginning you're set up to fail. And in reality, you kind of are. Because if we go back to my previous idea web, it goes back into this problem. Yale, Stanford, Ivy League, MIT. You have universities who are constantly hiring the top employees of their respected sectors and making sure that they hold a monopoly over that education. Because when have you ever seen a textbook be updated enough in high school to be taught coding, programming? Like, these are very integral things in our modern day society, which is learning how to program, learning C#, learning C++, or learning Python, let alone. Again, this all goes back into making sure that there's no competitors, making sure that there are no competitors that they can't account for. Now, that's actually a good idea, a good topic, because when you have the best education, or when you have the best teachers working in locations that you can constantly monitor and constantly see, that means you have a controlled environment. And when you have a controlled environment, you can see what workers can come out of that controlled environment. What's a good way for me to put this? It's very difficult for me to put this in. It's very difficult for me to put into paper. I wanted to say paper, but this is digital. It's essentially keeping the best employees that could come out of any respected sector in a specific location to make sure that when these people, or at least when these new, what do we want to call them? Nation building workers. Let's go here. So for workers, there are two workers that come out of this: the public sector and the private sector. The private sector has the best teachers, right? The best educators. Let's call them that. Best teachers. The best teachers will have access to, right? Not everybody makes it into Stanford. Not everybody makes it into MIT. But the best teachers have the best prospects. Prospects. How do I spell that? Prospects. Prospects are basically prospects. It's kind of like that apprenticeship, mentorship sort of style of things. The best teachers will essentially nurture the best students, so we'll call them prospects. And these prospects are under supervision of these best teachers. And a lot of these teachers that are the best of the best, they still work in private firms. So when these teachers are grooming these kids, they essentially get first dibs on where these people will go. And that's either through word of mouth, that's either through recommendations, because a lot of the times, we'll call it top industries, not everybody's the best at CCAT. CCAT is essentially 3D modeling. Not everybody is the best at programming. Not everybody is the best at. So when you have the best teachers teaching these prospects, when these prospects go to these top industries and they tell them, oh, I was taught, or I was under the tutelage of these teachers, a lot of these top industries are like, whoa, this was your teacher? What were your grades like? What's your portfolio look like? What's this? What's that? And the top industries will recognize the names of these best teachers because there's not that many people who teach these subjects, right? It becomes a very secluded circle of influence, right? You can account for, if this student went to this school, that means, and they studied this specific thing, there were only these teachers that were teaching these subjects. So what teacher did you take? What were your grades like? Do you have a personal letter of recommendation from your teacher? This is where this whole ethos came from. But again, that's only under the private industry. When you get to the public industry, a lot of the teachers that work in the public industry did not gain their knowledge or they didn't gain their experience through working at the top echelon of places. In reality, a lot of the public sector teachers were university students. They were just university students that either got their job through their teacher, or just applying realistically. This I could bring into a funny story, right? Because I was at LECC, and when I was in LECC, I had failed my communications class. Fuck, a speech, right? The class where you write up a speech and then you kind of dictate it. This was hilarious because I had failed it because I didn't turn in my final paper. So I had to retake it. But I took so the class I failed it at was Trade Tech, Los Angeles Trade Technical whatever the fuck community college. So then I switched because a lot of the classes that I wanted for the computer science stuff that I was doing, they weren't being taught there. So I had to go to LECC, Los Angeles City College. And while I was at Los Angeles City College, I decided to take the class during summer. And while I took it during summer, there was a teacher who was only working for the summer portion. Well, it turned out that this teacher who taught the communications class for this particular summer program was, I don't know how to explain it, but he was somebody at the top of his field. Somebody who used to write speeches for politicians. Somebody who would get hired. I still remember 1 week, or it wasn't like a week, but it was a few days. He disappeared to go write a speech for something, and he couldn't even tell us who he wrote the speech for. But you could, it was regardless of that. His class was phenomenal. I passed that class with an A, just because he was great at teaching. But that's not the point here. One of the stories that he told us was he was working for what's the company that does Cheetos? I don't even remember. But he worked for he had a contract, right? He said that this happened a few years ago where he was working for the company that managed Hot Cheetos. And the thing that they were doing a case study for, or at least you don't call it a case study, like a marketing study. They were essentially trying to figure out what made Hot Cheetos so popular. And it was his research group that essentially figured out that the most popular thing that they figured out about Hot Cheetos was that it left your fingertips red. So it was his group that won the contract because they essentially were just like, well, what if we just add more of whatever makes your fingers red? And that, right, it was a whole study on how to sell more of the product, and his group was the one that won that contract. But it was kind of jarring to me where he didn't teach from the book. He kind of went at his own pace. He went outside of the standardization practices, but was allowed to do so. And then I never saw that teacher ever again. It was just for that one summer that I was there. So what I'm trying to get to is people who typically come from the public side of things aren't people who are hired at the upper echelons of these marketing firms or of these technology sectors or whatever respective field that we're talking about, right? Archaeology or the medical industry or the medical field, et cetera, et cetera. Even in that's a whole other bag of ooh. Either way, getting back into the public industry, the public education sector side of things is caught up in the cycle of Congress and having industries lobbying to Congress to assure certain private contracts. And while the public industry is, or at least the public education side of things, is stuck in this loop, you have the private education sector, which gets to hire the best teachers. They get to have the best teachers that come from private firms that are still probably working in their own private firms. They probably still have contract work that they have to go away to for sometimes. And these best teachers have their own prospects. And their own prospects will go into the top echelons of the industry. Yes, there are exceptions to this rule, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about not the statistical anomaly, but what we're talking about is the statistical probability of how all of this will work out. Because again, this is an industry. The education system is a industry. They have no real, they're not really incentivized to make sure that everyone gets the same level of education, because we have two systems that are cut in between public funding and private funding, and how there are two sets of rules that these certain levels of right, because this goes from elementary to middle school to high school all the way to universities. There are public schools and there are private schools, and with the fact that private schools don't have to follow the rules that Congress has made for the public side of things, private schooling is typically why it's looked and regarded so highly. Either way. So, with workers, the workers that come out of the public side of things, I've noticed a very interesting trend from private and public. I've noticed that usually people who go to private schools will sometimes turn out to be managers, superintendents. What I'm trying to get in between all of these three is they are what I call just managers. People that manage people. On the public side of things, it's kind of rude to say this, but you're kind of bottlenecked into, what do I want to say? This could sound fucking rude as fuck. There's no real easy way for me to say this, but you have to look at the statistics in terms of what are there the most jobs of and what are the least jobs of. And what you usually typically find out is there are a lot more bottom level industry jobs, retail, cooks, waiters, like, what I want to say, surface level jobs or beginner level jobs, intermediate level jobs. Like, I don't know what word to say there. But a lot of that comes down to is that there are just more of these job openings than there are of having certain managerial positions or having certain cozy office desk jobs, right? Not everybody can be the best lawyer. Not everybody can be the best doctor. Not everybody can have their own private firm, etc., etc. But this goes into the ethos of, it's just, there's the bottleneck of, what do I want to say? Just job offerings in general. And if you do not have the background for it, you can't get these top level jobs, right? It's kind of why it's become a meme of six figures, right? You have a lot of modern women saying he must be at least this tall, make six figures, without realizing that the statistic of how many people make six figures is a very small percentage of people in the world. And that just comes down to the pre-existing industry. Because what people don't understand about certain industries is they allocate salaries, right? Because all of these industries know how many workers, what do I want to say? Just number of workers. They understand their structures. They understand how many workers they need for certain things. And they understand that they can't offer everybody six figures, because at the end of the day, how hard is the work that you're doing, and how valuable are you as, how valuable is your skill set? And, when you get into skill set, it comes down to, did you go to private or did you go to public? And your skill set is largely dictated on your work experience. It's also dictated by you as an individual. So again, you can go to public schooling, but usually what's super important here is, what kind of skill set did you develop? What kind of, I don't want to say personality, it's just what kind of individual are you? Because usually those are very specific traits. Not everybody has the same background. Not everybody grows up the same. So with what kind of person you are, with how you handle yourself, and when you combine that with a certain kind of skill set, it progresses you differently in life. But it's a whole other bag of worms. No. Because I'm just describing the education industry as a whole, not trying to get lost in the weeds here. No. The book industry. The book industry is only ever interested in one thing. Remember that. Sell, sell, sell. Sell books. Each and every year. Each and every year. That's all they ever care about. So, kind of one of the funniest portions of this industry is Penguin. I don't know if anybody actually knows them. Penguin is the largest book distributor of books that are in the public domain. Books like Frankenstein, books like what is it called? Kafka's. What's that Kafka book that's really good? Can't even remember. It's about the guy who's a cockroach. I don't know. Either way, they just redistribute books that are in the public domain, and what they do is they sell it with a different book cover. It's like every year. Think about that. But yeah, there's not much to say about the book industry. But the education industry as a whole has the problem of bare minimum. Because I want to focus on bare minimum. Because when it comes down to the bare minimum of the public education industry, in doing the bare minimum, the biggest problem that's come about this is the authenticity factor of this. Because if it's not in a book, if it's not published by, right, if it's not in a book, if it's not in a newspaper, and if it's not newspaper, or if it's not in the media, or if it's not talked about by a specific icon. Now, icon goes into a whole other form of thing, right? Because there are icons that have made a name for themselves, but at the end of the day, they were validated by either the newspaper or by the media, or by, what do we call it? Private sector. Either way. Yeah, where was this video going? I've got lost talking about the subject. Look at my previous web. USSR, John Dewey, the Rockefellers. Oh yeah, the Rockefellers. I just like saying the Rockefellers as a blanket term, but in reality, when I say Rockefellers, what I'm really talking about is I don't want to say board of directors. What do I want to say? I want to say industry. In reality, and that's not even a good way to describe it either. Because what I'm really trying to describe is editorial staff. No. How do I say this? There is essentially a guideline. And this guideline, it's not like it's written anywhere. It's not like it's specifically stated anywhere. It's just that if you don't say the right things, or if you don't adhere to what you learned from this education industry, it's not valid. It's not real. This is kind of where you get people like Randall Carlson, who I think he's an anthropologist, but he's more a geologist. Either way, you get people like him who went into the university system, went into making a name for themselves, but when they themselves found themselves at odds with the scholars, when they found themselves at odds, not just with the scholars, but when they found themselves at odds with scholarly journals, when they found themselves at odds with people who have made a name for themselves inside the system, and he comes around and he basically says, well, the way that we've mapped out human history isn't necessarily correct. You have a whole industry that looks at him and tells him, well, we've made millions of dollars. Who are you to invalidate our work? And you get into this whole problem of like, There is information out there that completely destroys the work that this whole education industry is built off of. And it's not to say that they didn't do good work. It's to say that what they were teaching isn't necessarily the truth. But the industry itself is like, but we're making money off of it. But the individual's like, but that's not the truth. You get into this whole problem of the industry will then go back into its little system. The industry will look for lobbying groups. They'll talk to Congress, and Congress will be like, all right, we'll handle this privately. And by them handling it privately, you essentially have, what do I want to say? What are they called? It's essentially like a soft union. Now, the education industry also has unions. And these unions come in the form of psychology unions. They have physicist unions. They have medical unions. Blah, 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 blah. And these unions offer what we know as beep, 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 right? A license. A license. A license of practice. A license of authenticity, right? This goes back into this whole authenticity issue. And if you are not a part of these unions that are under this education umbrella or the education industry, and you don't have this license, well, that means you're not valid. You're not authentic. You're not real. We're going to deny everything that you just said because you didn't come from our private club of good boys, right? Right. I'm using Randall Carlson as an example because he's someone I can easily use. Because once we get into the stuff like these unions, when anybody goes out of line and doesn't follow the guidelines, for example, this is a great example because this is what I do every day. Now everybody knows about fasting. But the medical industry is kind of having a hard time dealing with fasting. They're having a really hard time with the subject matter as a whole. When they talk about fasting, they don't talk about fasting. They talk about keto. And that goes into the keto industry. Because they would much rather you look at keto as an industry, as a product to purchase. It's easier to handle you that way. It's easier because I'm just selling you something. I'm not giving you the philosophy. I'm not giving you the methodology. I'm not giving you the full realm of understanding that keto, the word keto comes from the process in the medical field called ketosis. Or I think it's an I don't even know. Either way. They were just like, well, let's not tell them what ketosis is. Let's just sell them a dumb product that we call keto. And it just invalidates and minimizes what ketosis really is, which is a part of fasting. With fasting, I want to talk about somebody very interesting. His name is Dr. Sebi. Because Dr. Sebi has come now more to the forefront. And Dr. Sebi was somebody who, Dr. Sebi was eventually targeted by the Ford industry, by the Rockefellers, whatever. He was targeted by universities. He was targeted by basically anybody who's anybody in the medical industry. Dr. Sebi was a problem because Dr. Sebi had a cure for things he shouldn't have a cure for. I'm just going to write them down. I'm not going to say them actually. He had a cure for these things. And the medical industry was like, whoa now, you can't be saying the word cure because it invalidates their industry. It invalidates their money-making capabilities, right? Let's go back to the analogy when there's a new kid on the block trying to sell his product. There's the new gang member in the neighborhood, and he's trying to sell his own product. The older gang member is going to be like, you got to pay your dues. You gotta sell in these specific areas, and you gotta pay me some tax, or you gotta pay me something. So Dr. Sebi had a cure for these two things. Well, when that came about, Dr. Sebi had the Supreme Court. I don't even know why I'm writing this. He had the Supreme Court after him. The Supreme Court sued Sebi. And they were like, you can't be saying these things. Well, Dr. Sebi was like, well, I know the standardization or the standard practice of the medical field. I know how to write medical reports. And when Dr. Sebi showed up with his medical reports, he also showed up with his patients. He also showed up with data. And he also showed up with, how do I say? I don't want to say compounds. I don't want to say medicine. But we'll just leave it at data. We'll just leave it at data and medicine. He showed up with all this information and was just like, well, I know you're going to sue me, but I'm going to fight back. And I'm going to fight back the way you guys like to fight back. And what happened to Dr. Sebi? He won. He won his whole case. He won, walked away, leaving all of these medical fields, or all of these people who sponsor the medical field, pissed. Right? This goes back into the industry sector, the lobbyist groups, Congress, private contractors. He literally left them with their jaw on the floor because he walked away and he won. Which completely, right? And when you win something in the Supreme Court, I don't want to say it completely changes laws, but it does give credence and it does give validity. It gives it authenticity. It gives it that final thing that is required in the minds of people to be like, oh, there must be truth in this, right? In reality, all of this comes down to truth, or it breaks the original paradigm that was created, right? Which comes down to having a cure. They don't want cures in our world. They don't want cures in an industry because they can't sell you something. Which this is why I just wanted to have this video where I talk about the education industry, because the education industry feeds into this entire ethos. It feeds into this entire little playground that is controlled, managed, and governed by Congress. It's governed by government. It's also governed by these unions that give you a license for practice. And what happens when you don't follow the guidelines, or when you don't follow the science that is standardized by these unions? Well, you lose your license. You can't practice anymore. You're not allowed to exist in this environment. And, gets into a bigger problem when you kind of take into account how newspapers, media, books, and icons, and the private sector give authenticity to what these unions are talking about. So, another thing that I'm really trying to emphasize in this situation is the fact that when you have an industry, it doesn't have the public's interest in mind. It only has its own interest in mind. And this goes beyond money. This goes beyond any of that, because in reality, an industry or a business or a corporation is only trying to keep itself alive in the modern changing world. And as long as they can keep things to the bare minimum, they'll keep existing. As long as they keep things at the lowest bar possible, they can keep selling their products. They can keep people under a thumb, not knowing any better. Right? When you get people stuck in this loop, you can keep them stuck in what I call the marketing demographic. Demographic. And when you keep people stuck in the marketing demographic, they will only ever be consumers, not producers. Big difference here. Because a consumer is a buyer, a producer is a competitor. And this is what it all comes down to. Are you buying or are you competing against me? Because, to use this age-old analogy, basically, they don't want to deal with new people coming around thinking that they can change the pre-existing system, because this is very entrenched. It is super entrenched in itself, because you have universities, again, where public and private, right? When you're stuck in this public system, you're stuck in a there's a ceiling. You can only go so far. And even if you're in a private industry, and even though you're getting the best teachers, eventually these best teachers will have their best prospects, their best students who will go into a top industry. Remember, they have a ceiling. They have their license ceiling. They have the fact that they have to adhere to whatever the unions put forward into what they're allowed to talk about, what they're not allowed to talk about, and what science, or what, I don't want to say science because the science is settled. If you know where that comes from, that's a really big bag of worms to address. But in reality, what I'm saying with license, right? It's like you can't be a graphic designer and be like, oh, this is my license for graphic design. It's more a fact of, as long as you're not a serious threat, and as long as you're not a serious competitor to a certain industry in the world, they'll leave you alone. They won't care. But if you're disrupting this entire system, they don't like you, and they'll make sure to get rid of you. It gets harder to explain why lying about history matters. It gets harder to explain why lying about religious history or religious context or geographical certain material, that gets much harder to explain why they maintain that lie, because as it gets into this whole thing of, how do I say, bare minimum. And, there's this whole ethos as long as the individual or the workers don't understand who they are, it's easier to control them. But that gets into psychology, and that's not where I want to take this. Not psychology, but more of the human ingenuity, the human spirit aspect of things. That's somewhere else with all this. I'm just essentially describing that the education industry has no interest in developing people in the way that we assume them to do so. Does that make sense? Not really. Kind of very difficult to explain. Right? I'm like hinging on like this really big idea that I can't put into words, but I don't know. Very difficult. It's easier to manage stupid people. We could leave it at that. It's easier to manage people who just don't know anything, because they're always going to be dependent on somebody else to do the work for them, right? Well, why would my teacher lie to me? Well, it's not that your teacher lied to you, it's that the material that they learned from was skewed or was poisoned from the very beginning. And even their teacher didn't know the truth. Even their teacher's teacher didn't know the truth. Right? It goes into this very systemic problem where it's a problem of trust. We've given so much trust to these levels of this system that we have that we've lost the meaning of why we gave them trust to begin with. I think that's kind of what I'm trying to say. But yeah, how long is this video actually? 1 hour and 15. I did not think I was going to go that long at all. But yeah, anything else I could talk about? No Child Left Behind, 2001, seminary schools. Yeah, I don't even know. I think the biggest problem that I just wanted to talk about was just this: bills, lobbying, Congress, and lawmakers, and how this fits into taxes. Because usually what happens with this is your taxes are just being, what we call money laundering. There's a very soft form of money laundering that is going on with your taxes when it goes into the book industry, the publishing industry, and the education industry as a whole. Because we like to assume that they're doing great things with it, but I kind of shy away from ever saying that, because when you look at the sort of people that we've gotten, I don't want to say that, but when we look at the sort of effort that's been put into the public education sector, there's no real effort in any of it. Like, a lot of times the people that really make a name for themselves who come out of the public education sector, they were really hard workers. They were people who actually put so much effort in that they're the exception, not the rule. And it isn't fair to everybody else who goes to public education, because I've seen so many people who are incredibly intelligent come out of the public industry, or keep calling it industry, but people who go into public education, they'll come out of it and they have a really sour taste in their mouth about it. They'll be like, oh, I'm not good at this subject, or I'm not good at this subject, or I'm not good at this subject. And I remember one time meeting somebody who wrote incredible stories. Like, he wrote really great stories. But because of his time at his public school, he always assumed himself to be stupid. He'd always assumed himself to be terrible at English. But I remember him later going back to university and him meeting a teacher who actually looked at his work, and he had a complete 180 of himself where he was just like, wait, I'm not terrible at this. I'm actually fairly good. And, a person that I can actually name is Immortal Technique. He's a rapper, right? A lot of rappers don't consider themselves to being the best writers in the sense of, the way we look at the authenticity of an English major or somebody who's published a book. But Immortal Technique gets constantly communicated to for Hollywood to write certain jokes or to write certain things for certain scripts. And I would have never known that if he didn't mention it in his Instagram live. And it's just kind of like, to see somebody who isn't considered a scholar by any means be contacted and get paid to write for Hollywood scripts kind of really boggles the mind, because we would assume that it would be somebody who went to some great school or was a great writer from the beginning or had the talent for it. In reality, what I'm trying to say is, to go back to my original point, I've seen a lot of people who are incredibly intelligent come out of public education and they think that they're terrible at certain things, only for them to find out later in life that they're not. A lot of it was just preconceived notions that they developed from shitty schooling or shitty teachers or just a shitty experience that they carried to their later years in life. And we give so much, what I want to say, we give so much of ourselves to the authenticity of this system without realizing that it's an industry. It doesn't have your best interest in mind. It's more concerned with selling something than it is to imparting you with actual useful information. I think is the biggest point that I'm trying to get to. But yeah, now I'm gonna stop this so I can watch it myself.